Congressman, great to have you on BBC News today. I want to start with the news that Ireland, Norway, and Spain have announced that they will recognize Palestinian statehood next week. What's your reaction to that?
Well, Sumi, thanks for having me on today. I think it's a little premature for them to be recognizing the Palestinian state. We're still in the middle of a war in Gaza right now, and we still have hostages being held. There is no ceasefire. There's an ongoing conflict. And so I think it's way too premature to be recognizing the Palestinian statehood. In addition, as you know, there are two different elements of the Palestinians. You have Abu Mazen in the West Bank, and of course you have the terrorists in Gaza. And so to recognize them as a state, I think, is the wrong approach, particularly when our immediate goals ought to be getting all of the hostages back and secondarily trying to reach a ceasefire agreement.
You at the same time saw two members of Prime Minister Netanyahu's own war cabinet openly voice dissent because they say that Israel, and the Prime Minister in particular, does not have a plan for a post-war Gaza. So do you think that this is perhaps, for these countries at least, the only way to look to the next step?
Well, I don't want to judge the internal politics of Israel. They have a democracy. They have a system in place. And that'll play out the way that it does. They have opposition leaders and people that don't necessarily agree with every decision, just like our country does here in America. So I wouldn't read too much into that. But I will say, I think Israel has the right to defend itself and to execute the war that they're involved with right now. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't weigh in when we need to and give advice. Again, as I said, I think the goal should be getting back all of the hostages safely, the Israeli ones and the American ones, and trying to have tension simmer down and get to a ceasefire.
Do you think that that is Israel's interest at the moment as well? We've seen this growing rift between the White House and Prime Minister Netanyahu.
Well, I don't know. I mean, I think you have to let Israel. They're the ones on the ground. They're the ones that were attacked indiscriminately and barbarically on October 7th. They're the ones that have to defend their own land. And so I think you have to give them an opportunity to make those decisions. I think they'll do that in a democratic fashion. That's the nature of their government. And I think you have to let them make those decisions.
Okay, Congressman, I want to ask you also about China. You're on the China Committee in the House of Representatives, of course, and Kenya's President William Ruto is here on a 3-day state visit. And Kenya, as we know, is a key American ally in the region, but both Russia and China have been steadily building their footprint really across Africa. What worries you about China's influence in Africa?
Well, first of all, we welcome the Kenyan president to the United States. It's a wonderful time to have him here. And a great opportunity for us to talk about the valued bilateral relationship with Kenya. It spans 60 years. We've had a strong economic relationship, cultural relationship with Kenya. They're one of our partners when it comes to, obviously, East Africa primarily, but in the entire continent. And as we look at building other relationships throughout Africa, I think we should look at the example of Kenya. So but as you alluded to, there are obviously there's a strategic competition going on between the CCP, the Communist Chinese Party, with Russia and Wagner and the United States. But Kenya has a democracy. They stand for the rule of law. They believe in freedom of speech. Those are principles that China and Russia don't abide by, and ones that America can relate to Kenya on. Doesn't mean it's a perfect system, but we ought to highlight that relationship. That's part of why the president is here this week, and we ought to embrace that.
At the same time, China is at the moment Kenya's biggest creditor. We know that the Kenyan president is looking for debt relief. I mean, how can the U.S. convince Kenya that it is a better partner than China?
Well, I think you have to look at the lack of success with much of the Belt and Road. If you look at the promises that were made with Belt and Road, of course, the CCP, that's kind of their number one initiative, or was, with many of these third world countries, particularly in Africa and other areas of the world. But much of it has been a failure, where they make all these promises. They're going to use local labor. It's going to be top product that they produce, whether that's a infrastructure project or some type of economic promise or a new soccer stadium. But in the end, when one of those countries maybe can't make the payments, they default, and so China owns it then. And so I think there's been a mixed record when it comes to Belt and Road. And I think that's highlighted in Kenya. There's a number of examples of that where what was promised to them and what was articulated to them by the CCP has not come to fruition. But it also, I think, is pivotal that we be more engaged on the continent, whether that's through USAID, whether that's through the State Department, whether that's through other means. We have to continue to be engaged. I know the IMF and the World Bank that we work closely with can play an important role on the economic development of Kenya and other countries.
Okay, Congressman, we have to leave the conversation there for today, but thank you so much for joining us on BBC News.
Great to be with you. Take care.